think we can start this morning's program.
Have you guys not announced it this morning?
We haven't yet, but
First, I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the panel to today's discussion on European energy security and on challenges and opportunities. I've been given a little cheat sheet on necessary beginning announcements, just so that we're all clear. First is that this session is on the record, so that anything that anybody says can be reported. Please turn your phones off, the usual request. You can tweet using #ACSummit, and as usual during for these panels, the session is going to begin with remarks by the panelists, who will speak for 5 or 6 minutes each. Then I might have a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience for your questions. I think that we are extremely fortunate to have such a good panel, great panel this morning. I'll briefly introduce them. You are not here to listen to me, so we'll go as quickly as possible to them. And their biographies are in the materials that you've received, so I'll make brief introductions. The first two speakers will be first Jean Abiteboul, who is the president of Cheniere International. Cheniere has an obvious interest in exporting LNG from the United States to Europe, and I know Jean will have a lot of comments on that and how he sees the future with respect to that. And then he'll be immediately followed by Jason Bordoff. Jason has the longest title that I've ever seen for anybody since a title that I had back in the Clinton administration in the 1990s. He's the founding director of the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia, as well as a professor of professional practice in international and public affairs at Columbia. Jason also served as assistant to the president and senior director for energy and climate change during the Obama administration. I might say that Jason and I are members of one of the smallest unions in the United States, the Union of Founding Directors. So we'll hear from Jason on his comments on exports and response to what Jean has to say. Then we'll go to Joe Murphy from BP. Joe is the vice president for the Southern Corridor, and as you all know, that's the route that will take resources, and we'll be concerned about gas resources this morning from Azerbaijan through Georgia and Turkey and on into Europe. He'll be followed by Alan Riley, who is a distinguished law professor at City Law School of City University in London. Alan will talk about Europe's response to what's been happening with respect to Russia's actions, Ukraine. I've also asked him to comment on how the EU might effectively use its own laws to deal with these issues. And finally, Robin Dunnigan, who is the acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Diplomacy in the Energy Bureau at the State Department. Robin will talk about what is it that we're doing in working with Europe, and why do we care? Why should the United States care about what's happening with European energy security? So with that as an introduction, let me turn it immediately over to Jean to make his comments.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. I'm happy to be here, even at 9 o'clock in the morning. As you know, oil and gas are commodities with a high content, with a high diplomatic, military, and fiscal content. And incidentally, they also have some calorific value. So I will not spend too much time on diplomacy and politics. I think that in this room there are a lot of people who know much better than I do on this issue, but I will more focus on the energy part of the business and maybe more on natural gas. So we can wonder what would have happened or what would have not happened if the Shale revolution had not taken place. Just 2 or 3 numbers. 9 million barrels per day. This is the reduction in the import into the United States of oil. 9 million barrels per day. 5 million barrels per day of export of oil products. And 20 BCF per day of additional gas production into the US. So without the Shale revolution, these quantities of oil and gas would not exist and would have a major consequence on the balance of the market. The revolution has happened. Now these quantities will be available on the market. And as far as natural gas is concerned, in 2020, and if I only take into account the project of gas export which are launched or close to be launched, United States will export as much LNG, liquefied natural gas, as Qatar, about 70 million tons, which is a major consequence on the market. On this 70 million tons, Cheniere alone will export about 40 million tons. 40 million tons, it's about 6 BCF, 60 BCM of natural gas. 70 million tons, it's about 100 BCM of natural gas. It's more than half of the Russian gas which is exported to Europe. So all of this will have major consequences, and the consequences have already started even before the first drop of LNG. In terms of prices, some countries which were almost 100% dependent from Russian gas has been able to renegotiate their contract and get a 25% discount in their gas price. So the consequences have already started. And since we are today in Istanbul, if I look at this region, there are several regasification projects. There is one in Croatia, there is one in Greece, there are several in Turkey, there is one in Albania. So all these projects will probably not happen, but some of them will be done. The first mover will have an advantage. And of course, US LNG will reach this region in one way or another. So my point is, US LNG is a reality. US LNG will come to Europe and also to Asia. The consequences of this shale revolution is already seen as far as the prices are concerned. And of course, for the US, the issue is not to replace the Russian gas, but to bring some kind of diversification, geographic diversification, price diversification, connection to a huge market, which is a very well-organized market with a lot of financial products, so which will change the way to do gas business in Europe.
Thank you.
These were my preliminary considerations.
Hey, you certainly met the 5-minute requirement.
Okay.
And thank you very much for your points. And I think it now would be appropriate for Jason to talk about what he's been doing and what his group has been doing at Columbia, and how you react to this, and what you think the consequences are of the shale revolution and potential exports to Europe?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. And first, let me thank the Atlantic Council again for the invitation to join this year. It's really remarkable what this conference has become, and I always enjoy being here. And as someone who left government a little under 2 years ago to start a new research center focused on energy geopolitics, I know both how challenging it is to get something like that off the ground, but also how timely and important it is to be doing good work in this area right now, given how quickly the global energy landscape is changing. And I'm thrilled that the Atlantic Council is doing what they're doing with their Global Energy Center, and you really couldn't find a better person than Ambassador Morningstar to kick that off. So
Jason, could you talk a little more into the microphone?
I was saying nice things about you. Did you hear them?
Yeah.
Okay. And look forward to finding ways for us to work together. But it's really hard to find someone better than Dick with expertise in this area to kick something like this off. So congratulations for both doing it and for getting Ambassador Morningstar to do it. I agree with pretty much everything that John said. So just to put it in the context of European energy security, which is what we're sort of talking about on this panel, when you think about security and we think about there's always different ways to define exactly what that means, but availability, are there adequate supplies on the market? Affordability, can they be gotten at a competitive price? And then accessibility, do you have access to them? And then layer on top of that climate goals, which are so prevalent in driving much of EU energy policy right now. And I think where that's gotten the European Union is to a place that has had a very strong focus on overall greenhouse gas targets, but especially renewable targets. And if you have a mandate or a subsidy for heavy use of renewable energy, but at the same time have a fairly low carbon price, don't like shale gas in many parts of the continent, and don't like nuclear in many parts, this can have some perverse consequences where you actually see both a rise in renewables, a rise in coal use in many countries, and actually a rise in many parts in greenhouse gas emissions as well. So I think when you put all that together, we realize the need to make sure that policy is developed in such a way that achieves all of our objectives, energy security, economic goals, and environmental goals. And I think natural gas has a critically important role to play in helping Europe meet all of these objectives. And so I think it's important, notwithstanding concerns about energy security, concerns about what's happened with Russia and Ukraine recently, concerns about shale gas development in parts of the continent, that that we find a way to work with colleagues in Europe to make increasing use of natural gas and helping to achieve all of that. Because I think we've seen in the US what an important role natural gas can play, both from an economic standpoint, diversification standpoint, and also reducing emissions. When we think about the impact of US natural gas exports, first I just want to say, and maybe it's easier for me to say than people like from the government, but I continue to travel around the world and hear from some people in governments, some people from industry, but not as many, and hopefully John will back me up on this, that to the extent there was uncertainty a year or two or three ago about the US government's role in permitting and approving natural gas exports, that's largely been resolved. And if you now are a entity that can come up with the financing and get your contracts and commercially put a multi-billion-dollar project together and get through the process of approval at FERC, which is costly and time-consuming, but quite predictable. There's not a lot of uncertainty about going through it. You know what you need to do, and hopefully people who are actually doing that will agree with me there. You're going to get, unless something's very unusual about your project, a permit from the Department of Energy to export to non-free trade agreement countries. And we see those permits coming now on a regular basis, and I think there's much more certainty that government permitting is not going to be a barrier to supplying US gas into the global market. The impact of that, I think, is quite profound. I think you already heard John say that just the fact that the US is not importing the massive amounts of gas we were supposed to be importing right now has freed up a lot of natural gas supply into the global market, created more competition, more diversity. We've seen Gazprom renegotiate many contracts throughout Europe, Statoil as well, put downward pressure on prices in the European market. the share of gas this year that'll be sold on the basis of gas-to-gas competition rather than long-term oil index contracts will be over 50% in Europe, and that's up from around 10 or 15% just 5 or 6 years ago. So we've seen a big change in European gas markets because of the displaced imports to the US. And then once we start exporting, that effect is just increased many times over. And we just did a major project at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia looking at what the impact of US gas exports would be on European energy security and Russian foreign policy. And the short takeaway was that by increasing diversity of supply, by putting more supply into the market and more competition, you would put downward pressure on prices. We estimated that on average through 2020 or 2025, you'd cut Europe's energy import bill by about $21 billion a year. And this assumes the US were to export, let's say, 9 BCF a day, which is sort of a ballpark consensus figure consistent with what you just heard. That's about an 11% reduction in Europe's gas import bill. You would reduce Russia's gas export revenue by about $24 billion a year. That's a 27% reduction, so that's pretty significant for Gazprom. It's smaller as a share of the overall energy export budget because so much of it is driven by oil. You don't fundamentally change how much gas Europe imports from Russia, even if the US exports a lot of gas. A lot of this is going to Asia, not to Europe, and Russia just remains the low-cost supplier into the European market. So unless Europe wants to pay a very large premium to get its gas from elsewhere, it's going to continue to get its gas from Russia because it makes sense in many respects to do that. I think the question then is how do you reduce your vulnerability to a disruption in supply from Russia? That's a different question than how do you get off of Russian gas, because I think getting off Russian gas is neither economically feasible nor desirable probably. But reducing your vulnerability to a disruption means, pipeline reversals, interconnectors, the ability to bring LNG at a price premium into the market for a temporary period if you need to, building out gas storage, continuing to move forward with energy market reforms and the integration of a more European gas market, and other reforms in the third energy package. Putting reforms like that in place, along with reducing demand through efficiency and increasing development of domestic gas resources, including through shale, I think can go a long way toward increasing European energy security and making the best use of natural gas in the long term. So those are a couple of comments about what impact I think US gas will have in the European market, which I agree with Jean can be quite profound.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jason. Now I'd like to turn to Joe Murphy to talk about the Southern Corridor, something I've been heavily involved with as well, and to make your comments as to where you think things are, what really are the opportunities for Europe with respect to the Southern Corridor. Sometimes one hears the question, well, gee, there's only going to be 10 BCM that will go to Europe based on present production, present projected production of Shah Deniz, which would be a total of 16, 6 to Turkey, 10 to Europe. Does it make a difference? Is it really, some would ask the question, is it really worth the effort? And what do you see in the mid to long term, and why you think this is something that is a real opportunity?
Thank you. Good morning. I certainly hope it's worth an effort, as it's my job. So delighted to be here at the Atlantic Council. Particularly delighted that we're in Istanbul, which is a critical partner. Turkey is a critical partner in the Southern Gas Corridor and the progress of this project. I'm going to take us down a slightly different track. I'm going to actually talk about a real-life opportunity that is being built currently, which will offer options for energy security and diversification in Azerbaijan, in Europe. And I will refer back to your points there, Dick, related to the scale of this and the opportunity to increase it. The final investment decision was taken on the Southern Gas Corridor back in December 2013. And in my role, I have the privilege to deliver this project over the next 5 years. I've been in the role for 6 months. I've probably aged 6 years, but I've been in the role for about 6 months. But what I'd like to do is just give you a brief overview on the scope of the project, the progress we've made, because it's important to realize that an extreme amount of good progress has been made, the challenges we're facing, and also what's the legacy of this, and how is it going to help European security and diversification. So BP and SOCAR are taking a lead role in delivering a series of integrated pipelines, starting with platforms in the Caspian and going through 3,500 kilometers of pipelines through Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, Greece, Albania, and into Italy. This isn't just a large project. This is a series of mega projects, and we're looking at approximately a spend of $45 billion. We, BP, have a stake in all parts of the value chain, and these pipelines will be the first pipelines to connect Caspian gas into Europe, and that's a hugely important factor. The project's made up of 4 parts, and it's important to realize this. There's the Shah Deniz platforms in the Caspian, there's the SCPX pipelines through Azerbaijan and Georgia, both elements which are operated by BP. There's TANAP, which is operated by SOCAR through Turkey, and then TAP through Greece, Albania, and into Italy. This involves 7 countries, it involves 10 partners, and it will deliver, as Dick said, 16 BCMA of gas. And that 16 BCMA of gas has already been sold for the next 25 years. So all of the gas currently planned to be produced out of Shah Deniz has been sold already for the next 25 years. It's going to help create 30,000 jobs through its construction phase. So that is significant at a time of economic challenge in many of those countries. And it is built to be scalable to twice its size. So although in the initial stages the gas production into Europe is going to be in single digits, there's an opportunity to expand this pipeline further and to bring in resources from other countries in the area long term to supply gas into Europe. So what progress have we made? I'm pleased to say from the upstream perspective, we're 3/4 in. I have 17 more quarters to go, but we are 3/4 in at the moment. We've placed $9 billion worth of contracts. We're exactly on track for where we need to be in delivery of the project. TANAP is making extremely good progress. They've brought in engineering contractors, and many of you may have seen that the line pipe contracts were awarded a couple of weeks ago here in Turkey. And TAP have had some very good success with ESIAs being approved in both Greece and in Italy. So I want to leave the sort of progress conversation by making sure that you all realize this Southern Gas Corridor is happening, it is being built, and it will be delivered with the intent to have first gas into Europe in late 2019, early 2020. So what challenges are we facing? So I'm not even going to talk about the challenges technically, which, as you can imagine, are an extreme in a 3,500 kilometer pipeline. But I am going to talk about the genuine complexity of such a project. So not only do we have multiple different stakeholders in terms of both partners and countries, but we also have the need for a stable and enduring political, technical, commercial framework to be able to deliver this over the next 5 years. There are many, many uncertainties for us in delivering this, but we in this industry are very confident that we can deliver this and need to deliver this in terms of European security and diversification. So let me finish with what is the legacy we're going to leave and how does this fit with the concerns around security. This is a monumental project in any way that you look at it, in terms of its scale, in terms of its size, and in terms of the numbers we associate with it. But most importantly, this brings a new supply of gas into Europe. And this offers up a whole host of opportunities further down the line to bring in gas from multiple countries into Europe through a new route. It has a material positive impact on all of the countries that it works in. And as I say, 30,000 jobs during construction phase and over $45 billion worth of spend. In these turbulent times, it's going to be difficult to deliver this, and I'm sure we'll have many bumps in the road. But as Secretary Moniz said yesterday, what this project highlights and shows is, and will leave, is a legacy of agreements between the governments, between the partners, and between the buyers. it's absolutely awe-inspiring to see all of these countries along the Southern Corridor working together in a common goal to deliver this project. And I believe this project will enable us to have security and a diversification of gas supply for many decades to come. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Joe. And just to make very clear on the record, when I asked the question, you know, is this really worth it given the amount of gas and so forth, that was a provocative question from the moderator. Just for the record, given my involvement, I think it's very much worth it, just to make clear. The next speaker is Professor Riley, who will have a lot to say about the European response to what's happened with Russia and Ukraine. And again, I know I'm interested, and I hope the rest would be interested in how you see the use of the European legal system as a way to deal with these issues, particularly with respect to the South Stream pipeline, and what effect that has on Russia's need to continue to ship gas through Ukraine, and that the threat not to do so, whether or not that's an idle threat or not.
Okay, well, thank you very much. There's quite a lot to cover, so I will try and run through a number of the issues. I think it's worth starting by pointing out that actually, despite all of the, if you like, the propaganda, the truth remains that the only real destination for Russian gas for a very long time to come is going to be Europe, which is where Gazprom makes most of its profitable revenues. They made 2/3 of the gas goes to domestic consumption, 1/3 goes to foreign consumption, which is largely Europe, and that 1/3 makes most of Gazprom's profit. Now, the position is, we've heard all this talk about China. Well, the difficulty with China is that even if you take the deal as it stands, it's 150 billion cubic meters, 160 BCM to Europe, 38 BCM to China, which won't come in for at least 10 years. And the problem with that is that you have to add a question mark to that 10-year timescale in any event. Because although there's notionally a deal on price, there's no underlying deal yet on who's going to pay for the construction. And the construction is no small thing. Because at least with the Southern Corridor, you're putting it through Turkey, which has got roads and bridges and infrastructure and power systems. You're largely putting it through you're building not a 3,500 kilometer, but an 8,000 kilometer pipeline, and a large part of the territory you're putting it through is virgin territory with no roads, no power systems, no infrastructure whatsoever, and you're going to have to build all of that before you can build the pipelines. So the figure you get for the building of that is north of 50 billion cubic meters, north of $50 billion. And the question is, who is going to pay for it? That is unclear. So I think there's lots of questions about, first of all, who's going to pay for it, and what would be the true price of gas delivered to the Chinese seacoast. Is it really, there was all this talk about they've agreed a price around $380 per thousand cubic meters. Will it actually be anywhere near that price, or will it be north of $500 per thousand cubic meters actually in order to make any return? And would China in any event want gas at that price? So I think there's a huge issue to do with what are the alternatives. And then actually so we come to the conclusion that China is a very difficult place to deliver gas profitably for Gazprom. That's the first thing. The second question is about South Stream. We've already got the Nord Stream pipeline providing gas to Germany via the Baltic Sea. We've got the Yamal pipeline providing gas through Belarus and Poland into Europe. And we've got the main Ukrainian network providing about half of Russian gas supply into Europe. South Stream is not a new supply of gas, it's a diversionary pipeline which would switch Ukrainian gas provided through Ukraine into the South Stream pipeline through the Black Sea. Is that deliverable? There are questions about finance and so forth of that, because remember, all the pictures you see of South Stream merely show you a pipeline across the Black Sea. What you have to realize, in order to deliver the gas, it's not just a pipeline across the Black Sea, it's another pipeline from Siberia down to the Black Sea. And that makes it rather expensive. The real problem, I think, for South Stream now is a double legal problem. One is from US sanctions, and that is how far can you be involved in, as a Western partner, either as an energy company or as potentially a bank financing the South Stream project, when you've already got the sanctions laid upon the US system, and a prospect that progressive sanctions will make that situation much worse. And the difficulty is if you're doing transactional trade issues, you can take a risk on progressive sanctions. It's a one-shot deal which then ends and you've done your deal. But the trouble with something like South Stream is you've got a very long-term sunk cost problem, which means that you may not be sanctioned today, but you potentially are sanctioned tomorrow. So, of course, the freezing effect on any big project deal like South Stream is enormous, particularly from US sanctions. The prospect of DOJ or SEC investigation into any Western company involved, that's something which no CEO would sensibly want to get involved with. So I think that is a very serious issue for a lot of Western companies. And then the other side of this is the European Union law. The difficulty for South Stream is that the basis of the EU system today under the third energy package is a separation of the pipeline network from the supply. So you can't have the same company owning the pipeline and providing the supply, which is what you would end up with South Stream. Gazprom owning or part owning the pipeline and also providing the gas. Now that creates a very significant problem. Now you can get, if you build a new pipeline and it's providing additional competition, you can potentially get an exemption under European rules because a pipeline which provides new competition is a valuable additional source of supply and competition. The problem is, of course, South Stream is designed not as a competitive pipeline, but as a diversionary pipeline providing the same gas into Europe, but from a different route. And there you have a very significant problem for Gazprom to ever get an exemption, or for the European Commission to deliver an exemption. And it's interesting that Gazprom has never actually applied for an exemption under the European rules. So I think that's part of what is going on. So we've got vulnerability of Russia in terms of being able to supply gas anywhere else, and being forced by a mixture of US sanctions and EU law into going down the route of using the existing pipeline networks, that is the Nord Stream, Yamal, and the Ukrainian network. So that puts some pressure on keeping the existing routes in place and being forced to use those routes rather than creating any diversionary pipelines. And that's quite powerful if you like, legal structures placed upon Gazprom. The other powerful legal structure which is coming down the way is the Commission's antitrust investigation into Gazprom. Now, this was launched in September 2011 when DG Competition in Brussels launched a series of dawn raids against Gazprom's operations in Europe and Gazprom's allies, and obtained a lot of information from those raids, and followed up in September 2012 with the actual formal launch of proceedings against Gazprom. Now, they went on, and there was in December 2013, we had this entire discussion with Gazprom, which was opened up to negotiate a settlement. Now, no settlement has been arrived at, and what I suspect we are looking at now is we're moving down the way towards a prosecution document being issued. The prosecution document is known as a statement of objections, and we would expect that to be launched sometime next year, early next year. Now, if you look at the time scale, they've had about a year or so to negotiate some settlement with the Commission, and no settlement has been achieved. I would suspect the new Commissioner who's come in will review the situation. Gazprom will be given one more opportunity to try and negotiate, and then we'll move down the road towards a prosecutorial stage of the case. Now, what's already happened is that the previous Commissioner, Amunier, indicated that a statement of objections had already been written. The rumour is that the statement of objections, the prosecution document, is already 600 pages long, which will make it the longest prosecutorial document ever issued by the Commission. And of course, the point about this is that it's not so much the size of the thing, it's the issues it's dealing with, which threatens a lot of Gazprom's traditional behaviours in Europe. It's looking at three major things. One is destination clauses, under which it's able to separate out the European market, so essentially operate price discrimination between different European states. Of course, that's a breach of the EU single market rules. Those companies are supposed to treat the EU market as one market, and they're not allowed to discriminate without objective justification between the different states. So that's one issue. The second is the denial of third-party access. So Gazprom using its control of the pipeline network to actually deny access to other companies coming in, providing gas at cheaper rates and so forth. So that, of course, is another breach of the competition rules. If the Commission is able to prove this, that will be quite serious for Gazprom. One of the potential options for the Commission will be to force sale of all Gazprom's pipeline networks across Europe. And the third issue is the pricing of Gazprom's gas. The issue that Lithuania, which is much closer to Europe, closer to Moscow, somehow pays much more gas than Gazprom's gas is sold at in the UK market, which is a lot further away from Moscow. And this is sort of contrary to kind of basic commercial arguments about netback pricing. The further you're away from the source of the gas, the more you should ordinarily pay. And again, issues raised there about price discrimination. So if all of those things come forward, I mean, the media bang on about the scale of the fine, but the real issue will be the remedies, the sale of assets, the imposition potentially of a monitoring trustee, the prohibition of indexation. And I think I'll just finish on an indexation point. The other, I think, serious problem, legal problem for Gazprom is the falling oil price, because most of Gazprom's gas is indexed to the oil price, and that has been falling. If it falls, I don't know, another $20 or so, you're getting into a realm where the hub pricing will be actually more attractive for Gazprom than the indexation. And the difficulty for Gazprom then is, what do you do? Because you're losing money. It will be better for you to actually go for hub pricing. But once you make that move, you'll never be able to move back again. And that will destroy hub pricing, indexation in Europe forever. So I think that's, and the other issue there for Gazprom is whether we would end up in a situation where Gazprom would actually sue all its customers to actually switch from index pricing to hub pricing in order to get onto the hub pricing track, which they can do mostly under their arbitration clauses and the price review clauses of their long-term supply contracts. And that will be a bit of a turnaround from the current situation where you often get a lot of their customers suing Gazprom under their price review clauses in places like the Stockholm Arbitration Tribunal. So that's another element of this which is quite interesting, and we'll see how that works out as well. So I think there is an enormous degree of legal pressure from the US, from the EU, and from the contracts they have signed, in a context of a market which is, I think, substantially moving against them. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alan. That is really helpful, and it will lead to maybe some opening questions that I'll ask after Robin's presentation. But let's move on to Robin Dunnigan to talk about where is the U.S. in all of this? What can the U.S. and the EU do together? And what are we doing together? And is it working?
Thank you. And thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting this event, which has really become such an important energy event, and hosting it in the most beautiful city, one of the most beautiful cities in the world. You asked in the beginning, Dick, if, does the United States care? And I think it's fair to say not only does the United States care deeply about Europe's energy security, but it's not, even though it's headlines today, European energy security is the topic at a lot of conferences, it's a big headline, but we've cared deeply about European energy security for a long, long time. I think 20 years ago, when we first started talking about the Southern Corridor, from the oil perspective, the United States was one of the strongest supporters of making that a reality. And in fact, I was posted to Turkey and worked very closely with Turkish colleagues to help make that a reality. And I think the United States, as Ambassador Morningstar knows, has worked really hard to make the gas part of the Southern Corridor a reality too. So European energy security is not new to the United States and something we've been committed to for a long time. In fact, I work in the Energy Bureau of the State Department, and most foreign ministries don't have an entire bureau focused on energy security. When then Secretary Clinton first came into office in January of 2009, one of her first trips that she took was to Europe, and it was right after Russia had cut off gas to Ukraine for the second time, and some of our European partners had actually gone for a couple of weeks without gas in the middle of winter. And it very much influenced Secretary Clinton's thinking about how integral energy security is to a country's national security. And she went on to create an Energy Resources Bureau and also create the US-EU Energy Council, or EU-US Energy Council. So I thought just to talk with a little more granularity about how we do cooperate on energy security and what we've done, I would just talk a little bit about the last 10 months. We had our last meeting of the US-EU Energy Council in April. The council is chaired by the Secretaries of Energy and State on the US side and their counterparts in the EU. When we met in April, we worked out a plan for helping Ukraine get through this winter, and looking at Ukraine's energy security for the medium and long term, not just the immediate term. We also worked out a diplomatic engagement plan of looking at very specific efforts we can take to strengthen Europe's energy security because it's downstream from Ukraine. Many of the countries are. So on the Ukraine side, looking at the immediate term, we talked about first, how do we get a gas agreement between Gazprom and Naftogaz to get through this winter? So there's not an immediate crisis. And after months of really hard work led by the EU and the United States supported, they did reach a gas agreement. And it's not the end of the problem, but it's a great solution for this winter. The agreement allows Ukraine to buy gas from Gazprom through March. We also looked at contingency plans. What if there isn't enough gas? What does Ukraine do? And the Department of Energy sent out several teams at different times to Ukraine, working with Europeans, the Canadians, international organizations, to have a plan in place in case there wasn't enough gas this winter. We also looked at medium and long term in Ukraine, so we're not in this position again next year. So that in 20 years or 5 years, Ukraine can choose to buy gas from Russia and doesn't have to buy gas from Russia. So we've put together an assistance plan. We're working very closely with the European Union and with Ukrainians on issues like energy efficiency, improving Ukraine's own domestic production of gas, which can improve significantly, looking at reform of the energy sector. So working with the European Union, we've put into place a lot of measures that not only will get Ukraine through this winter, but hopefully in 3, 4, 5 years, will put Ukraine on a path toward longer-term energy security. I couldn't agree more with what several of the panelists said about European energy security. It doesn't mean that Russia is not going to be an important provider of gas to Europe. It will be. And the question is it the only supplier or the main supplier to many of the countries? And the key to energy security is diversification. Diversification of fuel sources, diversification of supply, and diversification of routes. So we've worked really closely with our European partners to look at, what other gas can come into the market? The Southern Corridor, critical nodes, where can new LNG terminals be built? Lithuania opened up a new LNG terminal last month. Very important. For the first time, non-Russian gas will be able to come into that part of Europe. How does Europe take advantage of the new supplies of LNG that are going to be hitting the market in the next 4 or 5 years? The United States isn't the only country that's bringing new gas online. The Eastern Mediterranean, Australia, Canada, a lot of new gas will be coming online. How does Europe get that gas into Europe and then move it? Not just one direction, but many directions. How do you get the right interconnectors in place? How do you do reverse flow? So we've sort of done some painstaking kind of step-by-step work with our European partners on getting some of these pieces into place. The work isn't done. I think this is an opportunity. The crisis of the last year is an opportunity to get more done. I should say one last word about getting Ukraine through this winter and diplomatic engagement from the European Union and the United States is working very closely with countries like Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland to make reverse flow into Ukraine happen. That's made a big difference. Up to about a BCM a month right now is going into Ukraine from Poland and Slovakia. Hungary, I hope, will start again soon. Hungary was also sending gas into Ukraine. So those are some of the work we've been doing over the last 10 months, and I think is just one example of how the United States is committed to European energy security.
Thank you very much, Robin. That's great. I'm going to ask one question of the panel and then open it up to questions from the audience. And my question is based on really listening to what everybody, all of you have been saying. And that is, and as Robin just said, there are a lot of options. You know, there's been the shale gas revolution. There's more LNG now available for Europe apart from U.S. exports. There's the ultimately in the next year or two there'll be U.S. exports. The Southern Corridor and an expanded Southern Corridor over time is going to have a significant effect. Alan talked about the legal issues and potential ramifications of those. So the question that I ask and would like you to comment on is, who has the leverage? You know, you read in the press and you read about the politicians' response, some in Europe, the response to sanctions and on Russia, and you'd get the impression that you know, this is the end of the world, and if we're too tough on the Russians, then they're going to shut off gas and we're going to all freeze, and that we really have no choice but to come to an accommodation. And by the way, I'm not saying we shouldn't come to an accommodation, but the question becomes, wait a second, you know, who does have the leverage here? I think that the agreement between Russia and Ukraine recently, and with the great help of some people from the United States, like Robin and Amos and Carlos and John Elkind and others, is significant. But at the end of the day, and I ask this as a question, did the Russians really have any choice? The Russians have to sell gas to Europe from the standpoint of their own economy, and ultimately couldn't have no other choice but to ship gas and transit Ukraine because of, and at some point you could say, well, maybe there'll be a South Stream someday, but I think it may be over a lot of dead bodies if you believe what Alan's been saying. So I ask that as a question as to where is the leverage and how should that affect the policy of both the United States and the EU in dealing with Russia on these issues. So I would ask any of you, any or all of you, to comment.
I think part of the answer has been given by you into your question. I think the power, the leverage is on both sides. I believe that today Europe needs Russian gas and Russia needs the revenue from the gas which is exported to Europe. So I believe that there are two sides on your question, the short term and long term. On the long term, I really believe that there will be a large share of European gas which will be supplied by Russia. On the short term, if there is a crisis, and we have seen a crisis in, I remember, in January 2009, the Russian gas has been cut for about 2 or 3 weeks, and the winter was very cold, so the European grid was able to face the situation. Today, the regasification capacity in Europe for LNG, the load factor is 21%. It means that 80% of the capacity of regasification in Europe is not used. If there was a crisis, there are plenty of possibilities for Europe to attract LNG. Of course, Europe will have to compete with Asia, and at the end of the day, it will be a matter of price. But as long as Europe will be ready to pay a high price for LNG in a crisis situation, there will be possibility for Europe to be supplied with other gas than Russia. And again, in the long run, Russia and Europe will have to agree with each other for reliable and safe supply of gas.
I think it's worth making another point, which is which follows on from that, was that, and again, it's sort of kind of strange for a Brit to make a very positive point about the European Union, but one of the unacknowledged successes of European Union energy policy since 2009 has been the enactment of the gas supply regulation, which has required reverse flow for a large number for cross-border pipelines across Europe, and the what's called the European Energy Recovery Programme, which I think we spent about 1.3 billion euro on some interconnectors between countries. You know, maybe 50 million for a small interconnector, 100 million for a piece of reverse flow, and these small projects all across the region have created an integrated, or moved us towards a much more integrated European gas market than has ever existed before. So when we're talking about with the existing regasification capacity, and with the ability to then move that gas around the continent, we're in a much stronger position than ever before. And that is actually reflected by another factor, which is the impact of the third energy packages has been rolled out, which legally ensures free flow. So you've got the gas from new sources, potentially LNG. You have got the physical interconnection and the legal rules which underpin it. And all of that together, legal, physical, and the actual supply of alternative gas, is in place in a way which it wasn't in 2009. And that then you can already see the impact of that in terms of the reverse flow which is going on to Ukraine. That is actually a success of European policy, which I don't think we actually set out at all to achieve as a result of the 2009 reforms. But those were all focused on the European Union. But they have the accidental effect of also making it easier to protect Ukraine. So I think we've already seen the success of the European energy security policy in our ability to deliver reverse flow gas to Ukraine. And I think that gives us a very strong hope if there was a problem in this winter, we would actually be able to respond to it quite effectively. I'm sure there'll be one or two places where there would be problems, there would be stresses, and the EU's done this recently. I think October the 16th, they published the stress tests for energy security across the continent. But what it shows on the whole is that most of the EU will be very secure and will be supplied. Prices would go up, but the lights would remain on, there wouldn't be a problem. That's quite different from 2009, and that's an indication of the success of European policy over the last 5 years.
I would just say,
Jason.
I mean, I agree with Jean's point. There's leverage on both sides. But I think it's important not to overstate it. So, you know, about 3/4 of Europe's LNG import capacity is unused right now. That is an asset to be able to bring supplies in the event of an emergency. You need to make sure those supplies can get to the markets that need it in Eastern and Central Europe, which today is very challenging. So there is a limit to what you can do. We've seen Russia in the past willing to use gas as leverage. The fact that we had this till the 11th hour negotiation over Ukraine, I take Dick's point that in the end, you know, it was in their interest to strike a deal too. It was in their interest to supply gas. But Europe, Ukraine in particular, had relatively few options, and we've seen Russia willing to use that leverage certainly in the past, and we saw it again this year. So, you know, yes, Europe can find alternatives. As you said, they have to pay a premium to do it. LNG is not cheap stuff, so there's an economic penalty to doing that. Yes, Russia wants the revenue, so they don't want to not sell gas. But as I said, it's a much bigger deal for Gazprom than it is for the Kremlin as a whole. Gas export revenue is about 14% of Russia's energy export revenue. Obviously, oil, I think, is more than half. I mean, it's a much smaller share. So if you're thinking about absorbing a small, an economic hit to exert political leverage, they have demonstrated a willingness to do that and certainly have that potential again. And so as Robin said, the goal moving forward is to think about diversity of supply, alternatives, the ability to respond in an emergency to draw up more gas out of storage or import from other places. But I do think we need to sort of think about what the availability of supply will be looking out 5 or 10 years and what the cost is going to be. So certainly we'll have a lot of US and Australian LNG coming into the market. That's going to change the global LNG market, the global gas market in really significant ways. There's still a lot of questions about Eastern Mediterranean, about East African. These are very costly projects, and we're already seeing, BG put a project on hold in British Columbia, and other projects have not yet reached final investment decision. So they're going to have to compete in a pretty crowded market at very high prices. And so, if they happen, it's going to be because people are willing to sign long-term contracts at a price that's more than you're going to get your gas for from Russia, certainly. So, there's still a lot of question about how much of this will come online. One of the results from our study that I thought was pretty interesting was we found if the US exports 9 BCF a day of natural gas, you would only increase global gas supply by 1.7 BCF a day. And that's because a slightly higher US natural gas price as a result of the increased demand reduces US gas demand, but also because a lot of marginal projects in other places around the world start to look less economic in response to the downward pressure on price you'd have from US LNG. And East Africa got hit the hardest in our modeling of the global energy system at least. So I think we need to remember how costly this is and how challenging it's going to be to bring all these additional supplies online. Yes, Russia needs Europe as a market, but they still have leverage, and that's something that policy needs to address.
Very briefly, Robin, and then Jean, and we need to have some time for some questions from the audience.
So I think one question is not only who has leverage, but how do you get more leverage? And that's sort of retail 101, right? The more integrated a market is, the more options consumers have, the more leverage they have. And certainly when there's a situation where one supplier controls not only the product, but the way that product moves, consumers don't have a lot of leverage. So even, you asked earlier, does this 16 BCM from Southern Corridor matter? Of course it matters. Every time there's a new option giving Europeans more choices, it gives European consumers more leverage. In the case of Lithuania, it's not a lot of gas, but Lithuania was able to renegotiate its contract with Gazprom after, as they opened that terminal. So every time you have a new option, a new supply route, a new source coming into Europe, it's good for European consumers.
Yeah,
very briefly.
Very briefly, I wanted to add a word about the reverse flow. I must admit that I am not terribly excited about the reverse flow as long as you face a crisis coming from Russia with Russian gas, even if it comes from other routes. So I think, and everybody can see the limit of this reverse flow issue. I believe that reverse flow will become a reality when there will be a regasification terminal in the south, in Croatia, in Bulgaria, in Greece, in Turkey, which will be able to bring gas from south to north with a different origin of gas rather than Russian gas.
Thank you. Now can we go to the audience and have some questions, please, from the audience? And when you do ask a question, if you could identify yourself. I see two hands in that.
Thank you. It's a great news, American gas for Europe. But what is the final destination? Because there is not a common European energy policy. And some big countries like Germany, France, they solve their problem. But countries of Central Europe, Southeastern Europe, Baltic states, they're suffering of Russian monopoly and situation. There is a plan to help countries, the allies of the United States in Central Europe, Southeastern Europe, than to talk only Europe as a destination of American gas? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think that's what you heard Robin talk about the efforts that the U.S. government's taking to make sure that pipeline reversal capacity interconnectors get built so we can get more LNG imports to different markets in Europe, particularly the ones that are constrained in their ability to find alternatives. I know a lot of that work is happening. I do think most U.S. LNG exports will not go to Europe. They'll go to the Asian market because that's where the price will pull it in. I think that's okay from a European standpoint. I think that significantly increases European energy security for all the reasons we've just talked about, which is you have the ability in the event of an emergency to pull in supply in response, and there'll be a price response, right? So if you were to lose gas supply, you could go into the market, you could pay a premium, and you could divert some of those LNG exports into the European market. That alternative, that diversity of supply, gives you, makes you less vulnerable to a supply disruption. If you want to, on a regular basis, meet Europe's energy needs through LNG rather than pipeline gas from Russia, you're going to pay a very steep price to do that, an increase of 30–40% on your annual gas bill. So that may not be desirable on a regular basis. I think the question is, do you have the ability when you need it to pull gas in from the global market, pay a premium to do it, but get it to the markets that need it, and you need to make sure the infrastructure is in place to do that, and we have sufficient liquidity in the global LNG market.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything, Robin?
Only that I think there's projects of common interest or infrastructure projects that the European Union will fund to help build some of these interconnectors within Europe. And I think right now the list is something around 243 projects. I mean, I think most of us would agree that if you have a priority list of 243 projects, it's not really a priority list. So an important conversation that I know a lot of my European and Central European colleagues are having now is how do you get that list of 243 down to what are some real priority projects that we can get done that the European Union can fund? And I think that that's a conversation that's happening in Europe, and I think it's the right time for it, and hope that it produces some prioritization, real prioritization.
Thank you. Let's move on to the question right over here, and then to John Roberts afterwards.
Martin William, Geopolis. As we're seeing the gas market integrate both in Europe as well as globally, as you all are describing, we're also looking at a shift from a market that LNG market, at least, that was has been dominated by long-term contracts with prices based on full costs calculations across the entire chain, to markets that are much more centered around spot markets. So my question is, does that mean we're going to have to make peace with price volatility? We are going to see phases where market prices can actually go quite a bit below full cost prices that are usually being talked about, comparing Europe and the US, etc. And phases where prices are much above full cost. And does that mean when we worry about things like energy security or underutilized LNG import capacities in Europe, or things like competitiveness, like Abiteboul was talking about yesterday, do we need to develop a different frame of looking at these things and investment decisions, basically based on volatile markets?
Jason and then John.
I think I'll just say I think it's a really good point, a really good question. I do think we're seeing this tension play out now between the need for long-term certainty about returns to make a multi-billion-dollar, in a case of East Africa, tens of billions of dollars investment offshore, and the desire for people to renegotiate contracts and shift to spot pricing. And we've seen, everyone in Asia trying to create a hub and create a marker there. So there's a lot of desire to have spot natural gas prices, but you need that long-term certainty too. There's a tendency to talk today about getting off the oil linkage because that means a low price. Spot gas is low and oil linked is high. So that may be true today. We've been reminded in the last month that may not always be true. And so that is not necessarily where these projects are going to go. They're going to have enough certainty to get financing. But if you shift to spot gas prices as a way that we regularly buy a lot of LNG, I think the concern about price volatility is going to be an important one.
I believe that there are several issues in your question. The first thing, you can have long-term contracts, but with a spot index. It's more and more the case in Europe. Today, I think 60% of the gas sold in Europe is based on gas index, whether it's long-term contract or not. Second consideration, as far as Cheniere is concerned, we have sold more than 80% of our gas on long-term contracts. And we needed such long-term contract to finance the plant. But the long-term contract is based on Henry Hub, so the American gas index. Is it going to bring more volatility to the price? Maybe. But you also have more possibility to hedge the prices, to mitigate the risk by using the financial tools the American market is bringing. Third consideration, there is in the US contract, no destination clause, no take-or-pay obligation. So you have full flexibility to manage your contract. If you don't like to offtake LNG, you pay for the liquefaction fee, and it costs you $3 or $3.5 per million BTU, but you have no obligation to offtake the gas. And you can also offtake the gas and bring this LNG to other places in the world where this gas is more valorized. So it gives you a tool to mitigate your physical risk of balancing your equilibrium between demand and offer on your market, but also your price risk. So I think all these tools will change the way to do gas business, but at the end of the day, it doesn't mean that the volatility will be higher.
We have time only for a couple of more questions. John Roberts.
Hello. John Roberts with Methinks Limited and a fellow of the Atlantic Council. It's a question primarily to Joe Murphy. You said that the capacity of the Southern Gas Corridor could be doubled. In technical terms, how long would it take to double the capacity, assuming that the market said, you know, yeah, we can take another 15 or 16 BCM?
Morning, John. Nice to get another question from you at another conference. I was expecting that. So the pipeline is already built to deal with that capacity. It's a question of where the gas supply would come to fill that capacity. So the pipeline has the potential to have approximately 30 BCM, as you know from the scale of the pipeline, particularly built through Turkey. It's a question of where those gas resources come from. As I said, if you look at the gas that's coming out of Shah Deniz 2, that's approximately 16 BCMA, and that's already been sold. So the capacity would depend purely on where other gas supplies would come from, whether that be from Azeri gas or from other gas from the region.
Time for one or two questions. Are there other questions? Right over here.
Jan Storza. When you speak about Ukraine, you speak about physical gas. What about capacity of Ukraine to pay this gas?
A very good and direct question.
I'll say, I mean, one thing that's not directly responsive, but just before we wrap up, I did want to make the point. We've talked, the panel was about energy security. We've kind of talked about gas security. And it is important to think about it a little bit more holistically. And one example with Ukraine is the enormous opportunity that exists to reduce energy demand and increase energy efficiency. And so I do think we want to think, when we think about European energy security, about the role that renewables are going to play and the ability for gas to balance the variability, about the role that reducing the energy intensity of the economy can play, because that's really the most significant and important way to increase any country's energy security. We need to sort of think about the role gas is going to play in a broader portfolio.
Thank you. Last question, Mr. Cohen.
Ariel Cohen, Center for Energy, Natural Resources and Geopolitics in Washington. Could the panel please address the problems and the solutions the Eastern Med is facing? From what I know, the Israelis screwed up the regulatory framework and scared away the investors. The Cypriots and the Turks are going at each other. What is the role of the EU, of the US, And how important is it to get it right? Because the resources are there, they're not far away. You can get them out either by a pipeline or even maybe by compressed natural gas ships. So you may not be in need of a big LNG project there, but it looks like the political will is lacking and the regulatory sophistication is lacking as well. That was a question. Thank you.
Thanks, Ariel. That you could have an hour and a half response to that question, but can we have 30-second responses from whoever would like to do so?
Well, I'll kick off. I mean, my own view about it is that there is a lack of strategic thinking, and let me just start with Turkey on this. Is that we were talking about all the problems with Russian gas. I mean, we've got just the threat of disruption. We've got the broader problem upstream of Russian gas. And I think this is the kind of the existential problem for Europe, for the European Union, and for Turkey, is the lack of Russian investment in the upstream, and the danger that we could actually have a supply disruption which is much more fundamental simply because they've not invested enough. I mean, one of the criticisms that's made of the Russian state, the modern Russian state, is that it's eating its Soviet legacy and not replacing it with any more investment to develop Russia more broadly than even the energy sector. Well, that's the issue, and how that impacts upon the Eastern Med is this issue that around 60% of Turkish gas supply comes from Russia, and that what surely Turkey should be looking at is doing deals which provide it with a range of diverse supplies. And all of the problems in the Eastern Med, for whatever historic reasons that they exist, they should be they're nothing in comparison to the strategic energy security threat that is proposed, but that exists from over-dependence on Russian gas. And actually doing deals in the Eastern Med over Cyprus in relation to Israel, it makes a lot of sense for the potential suppliers, for Israel and Cyprus, to provide gas to Turkey. Turkey is the largest, most growing market in the region. They could be potentially very reliable and trustworthy suppliers. There is the potential for an identity of interest to be realized by all the parties, to my mind, is there. And the question is that can we get people thinking sufficiently strategically to actually pull all that together? But it is there, to my mind, there is a real potential. Once you realize the serious strategic supply vulnerabilities, then this is something which we should actually be looking at to properly develop.
Anybody want to add anything? 10 or 15 seconds.
Okay, 15 seconds. I think that you can't talk about the Eastern Med without going up 60,000 feet and talking a little bit about global demand for gas. We've talked a lot about global supply for gas. Global demand for gas is going through an equally remarkable shift. It's not Europe and US, OECD countries that are driving gas demand. In fact, our gas demand is flat or dropping. It's Asia, China, India. This is where gas demand is being driven. This is what's going to drive prices and movement of gas. So what does that tell you about the Eastern Med? It tells you that the Eastern Med gas solution is going to be regional. And I think if you're looking at a regional market for Eastern Med gas, that and not, because you're not going to, I just said we're going from the 60,000 foot back down to the Eastern Med, microscope. The solution has to be regional. The parties are going to make a decision about, is it going to be a source of conflict or a source of cooperation? And we'd like to see it be a source of cooperation so there can be a regional solution.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And before thanking our panel, I have a few announcements to make. One public service announcement and a hint to people. You may have noticed I'm wearing a headphone. I do speak English, even though my wife might disagree with that. My point is, if you're getting older and you're getting deaf and you have a difficult time hearing at conferences, just wear your headphone and listen to it in your language. It's unbelievable. It's like listening to an iPad on the plane or whatever. It really works. So Jason, I think you probably were talking loud enough at the beginning, but I hadn't put my headphone on. Now, having having said that, the next session begins at 10:30 on innovations and energy technologies, and that will be in this room in 10 minutes. I remind you all to wear, I guess we're not doing it, but wear your credentials at all time, and bring all your belongings, including your headset. So I think this has been just a terrific group and a terrific panel, and I hope you'll join me in thanking the whole panel.